I could not get the gut to cooperate. Sadiq handed me a few leaves from the bush in the middle of the room, motioned for me to put them in my mouth and chew. His finger arrowed to the back teeth, and then to the cheek, which was already the size of a tennis ball. The leaves were tender, and I deposited them as deeply as I could. Chewing gut was customary at all meetings in the afternoon, and I was going to be a good visitor and partake. Immediately, you know what I'm talking about, juice oozed around my gums, flowed in the canal between my lips and teeth. It was harsh, bitter, tasted like the smell of oven cleaner. I grimaced hard. Sadiq smiled, flicked his finger with a, "Go on, have more motion." I lifted my hand in a polite no. My throat was coated, and I couldn't navigate the wad into my cheek to make room for more. I sucked it back. It was unbearable. I choked a minute, gagged, and grabbed a Kleenex and spit. The other men at the Mufraj paused in their conversation, put down their cigarettes, and looked at me. Tears ran down my face. Muhammad Sharafuddin, my translator, offered me some ginger ale, which I snatched from his hand and downed it warm in one swallow, and then took a deep breath. This was a bad start in Yemen. Failing at my first gut chew, I needed to try again. I carefully pulled off spears from the top of the bush and pressed them against my tongue like Holy Communion. A bitter tang shot around my gums. My teeth were bathed again. I puckered, gagged, forced myself not to swallow anything. My eyes filled a river, and I wanted to spit, vomit, do anything to get rid of it. I couldn't speak. Little quivers crawled on my skin. Finally, Muhammad lifted up the spittoon and held it to my face. Nice, Almez. Very pretty. Earlier, when I entered the Mufraj in Muhammad Safadi's house, the pillows on the floor were bathed in light. Rosettes of color circled the room. Its entire perimeter was padded with cushions arranged like floor-level couches. I left my shoes at the doorway with the large men's sandals and shimmied down to my seat in the middle, designated for the honored guest. Each pillow was supplied with a small table with 5 items: tissue, ginger ale, Marlboros, an unnamed perfume, and a spittoon. This was a literary event. A poetry reading, and all the men in the room were leading writers and journalists in Sunnah. The host, Muhammad Safadi, was famous for his progressive poetry advocating women's rights. Next to him, an editor of a daily newspaper was describing his 40 days in solitary confinement in one of his frequent prison visits. His release was the previous week, and he leaned back on his elbow, smoking with his stash of Q in his mouth, describing his interrogation. I was astonished and examined his long face, his light blue robe, almost basketball player stature. Another writer, stocky and balding, nodded his head vigorously. Oh, he knew that cell well, its damp walls and metal door. He knew that interrogator. The description inspired an eruption of chatter. Muhammad whispered, "That man," he pointed to the balding one, "and that one," he indicated the quiet man at his side, "are members of parliament. Why does everybody end up in prison?" Muhammad smiled. Lots of reasons. Insurgency is the most popular charge. But a poem, an article, a speech, maybe even a thought. He laughed at himself. But we're used to it. It's only inconvenient. Everything was described this way, as an inconvenience. A jail term for an editor, the cultural attache's kidnapping, the skirmish in the street we had to drive around while the Ba'ath Party and the opposition had a shootout. I surveyed the writers in the room, their drawn faces and dewy eyes and smiles. This was one of those moments where I hid quietly, stealthily, riding the electricity that moved from one person to the next. The members of parliament and the writers reported bone-chilling stories of endless questioning and miserable confinement. Legs crossed, hands on knees, mouths stuffed with weed. The experiences were blown away with the smoke from their Marlboros. Everyone seemed to return to his life as if it had only been an inconvenience, as Muhammad had said. They sat in a mufraj with their friends and chewed gut. So when the writers brought up my poem that appeared in the newspaper, I turned shy, pushed the attention away. That morning, the concierge had shown me my picture at the bottom of the front page of the Yemen Times. Now it felt silly. Everyone in the room had seen it and wanted to hear more. Never feeling more humble, I read to them while they leaned back, their legs tucked under, their cheeks filled with God. Maybe it's a contrast I walked with the new friend Carol Laherd through the souk when I arrived, but Sanaa feels more like Saint-Tropez compared to Saudi Arabia. Carol and I were both wearing our raincoats and modest scarves. She and her husband Ryan were leaving Yemen the following day. They were giving me a quick lay of the land tour that went from the busy modern streets of Sanaa through the gate, Bab al-Yemen, to a magnificent open market where one merchant stand seemed to overlap with another's. Donkeys and camels pulling carts came through the middle carrying goods to the stalls. The sun brightened the tables with shoes and fabrics, bundles of grapes, and mountains of tangerines. In the souk al-Milh, Carol guided me down the aisles with pots and pans stacked like poker chips, to the alleyways where meat was slaughtered, carcasses hanging and emptied, on to a smaller, more narrow maze of silver market. The jewelry shops occupied the bottom floor of the ancient buildings. Rows of antique silver pieces, necklaces embedded with lapis lazuli, garnet, coral, amber, and pearl dangled from the windows and were displayed on the walls. We browsed, and Carol picked out a few last-minute gifts. In one shop, the walls were lined with velvet, displaying beautiful latticed earrings, row after row, each elaborate and twisted into a tantalizing design. The vendor was halfway lying on a tattered rug, his eyes full of liquid. It was after 2 o'clock, so he had had his got. He rose up on his elbow and greeted us, waved his hand. The earrings glimmered like the ocean, the wet stones reflecting the sun. As he pushed to his feet, his face gleamed toward me. "Shaira, welcome to my shop." The man in his small amphetamine high recognized me as the visiting poet. On the torn blanket he was lying was the daily paper with my picture and my poem. He liked my poetry very much. He opened his arms and sang to me. Carol nodded her head. He was telling us about the poem, the story of my father in the war. Then he turned to me and asked, "You know who I like best of all American poets?" Carol answered him, said that we would love to know. He bent toward the table, pulled up a cloth, and brought out some newspaper clippings with more poetry. Gwendolyn Brooks. He shook the paper tightly. I turned to Carol. Did he say Gwendolyn Brooks? Carol translated my question to him in Arabic. Gwendolyn Brooks, he repeated. We real cool, we skip school, we play pool. How did this sound transform into the slushy gutterings of Arabic? I smiled usually, remembering my first memory of reading Brooks in college. I recited it like a jump rope rhyme for weeks. Did the Arabic version ring out like the sing-songy Kita my father and his brothers composed on their terrace under the stars back in the old days? Carol explained, everyone in Yemen reads poetry. Poetry is in the newspaper every day. It's part of their lives. Poetry every day? The man was nodding and smiling. I got chills seeing his happiness or his high, and I smiled an intense, aching smile at him. It was going down and down. At him, at Gwendolyn Brooks, at the whole notion of poetry every day. Here was my gut high. As we exited the market, we saw boys standing in a line displaying lengths of material 12 feet long. They created a maze of magical colors and cloths, rivers of reds and yellows and purples and scarlets like I never seen. The archway divided the protected market from the main street where the buzz of cars, traffics, dubobs were stuffed with passengers, and more shoppers going to the electronics store. Now, back in the 20th century, I saw the press of people occupying every corner and every vehicle. Children were running everywhere. The buses were filled. Bodies were spilling out of the entrances and exits. Hands reached out of the window. People were pushed together, heads down, moving. Small Fiat taxis buzzed by carrying businessmen and visitors. Some were reading newspapers. Some were reading poetry. Thank you.